Born in the 2nd century, February 15th, 2021, Episode 4, hosted by Chris Palmero, broadcast music, Pompey Gray. Why don't we talk about the Gospel of Mark? Written in Tripoli of Syria in 120 AD in the aftermath of the Kitos Rebellion, Christianity as a distinct faith then being in its infancy. To ground the origin story of its legendary founder firmly in time and space once and for all. To synthesize discordant traditions about Jesus, to pull a God down to earth. He said, "Do you not know this parable? Then how will you know any of the parables?" Could this be the reason you're mistaken, that you don't understand the writings or even the power of God? I'm telling you that you today, on this night, before the rooster crows twice, will renounce me 3 times. A work of brutish lateness. This new era, the traditional Judaism has begun to align behind the Pharisees. The first Christians begin to feel the social pressure of rejection. They're still atomized in the mutually hostile gangs and tribes that evolved out of the gnosis and the charged religious atmosphere of the time. The communities who worshipped a heavenly Messiah are now finding themselves threatened by rivals who traded on the words and deeds of a legendary but earthly Jesus. We continue our New Testament journey by exposing the late origins and fictive nature of the Gospel of Mark. We demonstrate that the Gospel of Mark, the first biographical source for the life of Jesus, and the source of all other biographical information about him, was created not only to firmly establish the life, career, and death of Jesus in temporal history, but to answer and annihilate competing views of Jesus that threatened the author's community. Above all, we want to demonstrate that the text was written much later than the 65 to 75 AD time period in which it's usually placed. In a word, my argument is going to be based on 3 main points. One is that the Gospel of Mark isn't quoted or cited until very late. Another is that it absolutely pulsates with anachronisms. And lastly, it seems like what the author did was take stories out of the Septuagint and rewrite them in the format of a 2nd century Greek novel called Ephesian Tale, making like a Christian Ephesian tale or Christian tale, basically. And this is what will be discussed in the course of this show. And we also want to look at each of the reasons that the document is commonly dated to 65 or 75 AD and see if we can't demolish those one by one. But first, we have to engage in some world building. And I invite you to ask yourself as we continue whether or not there's any compelling reason to consider the Gospel of Mark a reliable and early source for the life of Jesus. Between 70 AD and 110 AD, a new movement developed within Palestinian and Syrian Judaism, and we might call it the Kingdom Movement. And whether we want to call it Judaism tinged with Cynic philosophy or cynicism tinged with Jewish philosophy, we know that this movement, which traced its origins back to John the Baptist, a possibly legendary figure, developed an apocalyptic worldview in this time period and began to rearrange the myth of its origins. It now started to trace them back to the equally legendary figure of Jesus, whom they imagined had split from John at some point, and this sect was later absorbed by mainstream Christianity. Its stories and its traditions became a source for many of Jesus' sayings in the Gospels. The stories and the sayings were ascribed to Jesus, but in every case, they were originally spoken by the itinerant prophets and preachers of the Kingdom Movement. Now, sometime around 100 AD, at the midpoint of the development of this sect, another renegade early Christian group began to develop the Jesus character in its own way. They emphasized the power and the wonder wrought by Jesus and the many earthly miracles that they assumed he conducted when he was on earth at some point in the distant past. And they believed that Jesus had to have conducted miracles in his career because they themselves conducted miracles, or at least what we would now call faith healings. And they believed that they did this through the power of the indwelling Jesus. It's not for nothing that the 2nd and even 3rd century Christians preserve memories of a time when Jesus was just one powerful name among many that were used by exorcists. An exorcism spell that we found in an ancient garbage dump in Egypt has the phrase, "I command you in the name of Jesus, God of the Hebrews," commanding a demon to exit the person. So we have two groups, the kingdom movement and this breakaway sect of miracle workers. And both sectarian groups looked to an earthly Jesus, whom they believed had lived on earth, as a means to legitimate their own mission. But they as yet knew nothing of the time and the circumstances of his life, other than it took place once upon a time, long before any of them were even born. And all they knew was that Jesus had been born and lived after the life, career, and death of John the Baptist. And at some point in the early 2nd century, these two outfits rolled up into Tripoli like Wild West gangs and set up shop. But there was already a Christian community there, and one that had been quietly building up its own mythology about Jesus for dozens of years before their arrival. In fact, it had first been visited by the old Simonian missionaries back in the years after the Great Roman-Jewish War. And this, for lack of a better term, we can call the community of Mark. Now, my landlady, when I lived in D.C., had a small dog, and she got a second one, another poodle. And she said that once she had both dogs, the first dog was happy in the beginning and had a new companion to play with. But eventually, when that second dog didn't leave, after a few days, the first one was giving her this look like, okay, is this other animal going to go away at some point? For various reasons, it decided that it preferred not having a permanent playmate. In the earliest years of Christianity, as I said in the first episode, the Mediterranean world had a number of small groups that worshiped Jesus or Christ in some way, but these groups came to this belief for the most part independently. And in this environment, when your Jewish brethren are already giving you static because your Jesus beliefs are making them uncomfortable, it's starting to seem like they conflict with the Torah, you look for any friends you can get. And Mark's community was probably thrilled when these kingdom people and these miracle workers showed up, like, hey, kindred spirits, They got along with them for a while, but because Christianity originated separately in multiple places, because the various Christian religions didn't come from a common source, eventually these small groups would get sick of one another, like the dog that wants that new playmate to finally go away. There's a reason why like 25 out of the 27 New Testament books, even tiny ones like 3rd John or whatever, all have this brutally angry attitude towards rival teachings. And there's so many instances of these rival teachings being cited. And the reason is that all of these teachings come from independent streams. If the New Testament documents were truly that early, there would be no way to explain this phenomenon at all. It's like the earlier you put those documents, the harder it is to explain how and why 8 different views of Jesus developed within a 25-year time period. And the Gospel of Mark is a great example of this because, like Paul's letters and these John letters and Matthew and so forth, those writings have a tendency to just outright trash their opponents, like Andrew Dice Clay style. But the Gospel of Mark has a much more peaceful, much more clever way of dealing with its enemies. Mark's community eventually began to clash with the newcomers before deciding that something had to be done. This community wasn't violent by any means, and it frankly had enough problems already. So it chose to engage its enemies with literature. And it raised up the most important text in the history of the entire Western world. These were the circumstances of the creation of Mark. Now, Tripoli on the Syrian coast is now the city of Trablus in Lebanon, and it was given the Greek name Three Cities because of a misunderstanding by its ancient Greek settlers. Its prior name was Derbli, which sounded to them like Tripolis, and it was 2 days' travel from Antioch, which was the ancient spawn point of Christian sectarians. Almost all the early Christian breakaway groups are said to come from Antioch, the modern city of Antakya on the Orontes River, on the very southern tip of the modern nation of Turkey. Antioch, which Paul in his letters remembers as kind of the central services office for Christianity. Antioch, which Acts of the Apostles remembers as the place where the believers in this new religion first received their name of Christians. The third city of the Roman Empire after Alexandria and Rome. And Tripoli was 3 days from Galilee, the stomping grounds of Jesus. It was 4 days from Jerusalem, which the New Testament claims is the place where Christianity originated. And it was only a day's sail from the city of Tyre, which Mark says is the place where the Gentiles first came to believe in Jesus, the woman of the Syro-Phoenician race, who begged him to drive the demon out of her daughter. He said, "It's not beautiful to take bread from children and throw it to puppies." She said, "Lord, these same puppies eat the children's crumbs that they happen to throw under the table." He said, "Because of your statement, go away. The demon has exited your daughter." Close enough to Galilee and Judea to feel a kinship attachment to the legendary early Christians of those regions, but not too close to have an actual Palestinian background. The Gospel of Mark was written here, and it was written during and after the Kitos War, the great Second Roman-Jewish War that raged throughout the eastern half of the empire in the reign of Trajan. And the sources depict it as a mass uprising of the Jewish people from Cyprus to Cyrene to Mesopotamia, throughout the whole Levantine region, the region that includes the community of Mark, heirs to the zealots of the previous generation. And the war ended with a Roman victory at the end of the reign of Trajan and the rise to power of his adopted son Hadrian, a true enemy of the Jews, as the Talmud remembers. And the revolt was suppressed, but tensions between the Jews and the Romans were left unresolved. In fact, the war ended with a pitched battle in Judea, to which the leader of the rebellion had fled. After the war, the Emperor Hadrian stationed the 6th Legion and the so-called Ironbound Legion in the town of Caesarea. And what the Talmud remembers most about the Jewish defeat in the Kitos War is the death of a group of martyrs killed personally by Trajan. It's a literary legend. Quote, "Let your God come and save you from my hand." Even so, Trajan remained unmoved by their response and killed them immediately. It's said that they hadn't moved from the place of execution when 2 officials arrived from Rome with permission to remove Trajan from power, and they split his skull with clubs. End quote. Now, what's interesting there is that the Talmud says that Trajan killed the Jewish martyrs and was then executed by 2 thugs from Rome. But in fact, the writers are actually confused here, because in this legend, it was supposed to be the Roman general Lucius Quietus who killed the martyrs and was then himself killed by Hadrian. And it's from the name of that general, Quietus, who's credited with putting down the rebellion, that we get the name for the war. In the Kitos War, though it isn't talked about much today, it cast a long shadow on the 2nd century. Even 50 years later, there are documents from the Oxyrhynchos garbage dump. People in faraway Egypt are returning to settle accounts, things like wills and testaments. And the documents explain that these issues were thrown into confusion by the, quote, Jewish rebellion, this war that happened 40 years earlier. You know, we get a brother and sister that tried to come to Egypt to inherit property that their grandfather had left them like 40 years earlier, and that would have been the time of the Kitos War, and they cite that war as a reason why no one from the family had stepped forward up till then. So this war had an impact on this entire region. What we'll find is that whenever what we might call the mainstream Judaism experienced conflict with Rome, it always sets off a reaction in early Christianity, a kind of a push and pull dynamic. Now, the Jews in the aftermath of the temple's destruction are beginning to coalesce around new religious authorities, new ideas, and in doing so, they're beginning to more strictly define their national and their religious character. They're exploring and articulating more and more what it means to be a Jew, and this results in some rejection of the early Christians, whose beliefs, which would have been acceptable in the 1st century to a great extent, are beginning to seem suspect, and that's the push reaction. But the early Christians themselves also disagree with the direction that Judaism appears to be taking. Remember that they consider themselves, at least originally, to be Jews, and so they begin to stir up trouble in their own right. And that's the pull reaction. You know, things like lashing out against the Pharisees, having angry disputes over the law, disagreeing over what the law says and means in reality, and so forth, and things that we encounter in the Gospel of Mark. And the Kitos War, just like the later Bar Kokhba War, ends up supercharging those interactions. You know, those atoms are beginning to spin with more and more intensity, throwing off electrons, and those would be the different Christian sects and ideas that are beginning to encounter and to conflict with each other. And because of the war, Mark also is concerned, just like the later gospel writers, with differentiating the early Christians from the Jews. Like, they have enough problems. And the last thing they need is for the Romans to tie them in with sedition and rebellion. This is the environment in which the Gospel of Mark was created. And we'll talk later about an important clue that Mark gives as to his time of writing during the Kitos War. Now, I should mention offhand that the book is not actually entitled The Gospel of Mark. That's more of a shorthand. And to the extent that it has any title, it would be according to Mark. And there are only two types of books in all of ancient literature that have titles like this. And this is what David Trobisch, the New Testament scholar, pointed out. One type of book is the New Testament Gospels, according to Mark, according to Matthew, Luke, John. And the other is the 2nd century Greek translations of the Jewish Bible, according to Aquila, according to Symmachus, according to Theodotion. If you were to read the Gospel of Mark without any prior knowledge or without knowing any other Christian text, you would be reading a story about a divine man whose physical appearance is never described, whose personality is barely described, who performs a chain of healing and nature miracles. Some quotes from Mark, whose language is quite crude, by the way, unpolished, and we'll intersperse them throughout. They were bringing to him all those suffering evilly and those being demonized. And the whole city was congregated on one spot near the door. He's frequently said to be a great teacher whose authoritative teaching stuns and spellbinds large crowds, which always seem to be following him. He was teaching them much in parables, and he was saying to them in his teaching. Yet, aside from a few proof texts and a few simple discourses on the Torah, the actual content of his teaching is barely mentioned. How are the scribes saying the Anointed One is a son of David? Because David himself said in the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, Lord said to my Lord, be sitting at my right until whenever I might put your enemies under your feet. He refers to himself as the Son of Man, and he's accompanied by 12 buffoons who constantly fail to grasp his divine nature and the significance of his words and actions, even while the surrounding crowds do grasp these things, not to mention the evil spirits whom he has to constantly enjoin not to reveal his identity. They said, why don't we go off and buy 200 denarii worth of bread to give these people something to eat? He begins to repeatedly predict his own suffering, death, and resurrection. And his disciples fail to comprehend even these straightforward predictions, even when the lesson is illuminated for them by the voice of God himself on the holy mountain. And they eventually deny him and scatter once these predictions come true. Rabbi, it's beautiful that we're here, and may we make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. In fact, one of his disciples is responsible for betraying him to the civil power. You came out with sabers and clubs to arrest me as against some brigand. He's put on trial by the Roman hegemon at the instigation of the Jewish religious authority. He's tortured and crucified in a segment abounding in allusions to the Old Testament. He dies and is buried. 2 women venture to his tomb only to find it empty. And they spoke nothing to anyone, for they were filling themselves with fear. This is the Gospel of Mark. And I follow Theodore Whedon in reading this document as the product of a conflict between community members who disagreed on the nature of Jesus. And it's a thesis that he outlines in his book, Mark, Traditions and Conflict, from 1971 AD. And the main difference with this theory that I'm introducing here is that that conflict came about 50 years later than Theodore Whedon says. And the author of the Gospel of Mark was primarily attacking the miracle worker sect that I mentioned earlier. You know, this early Christian splinter group who believed that the authority of Jesus was proved through his miracles, which they reproduced on a daily basis through his indwelling in them. And the miracle worker sect and the kingdom sect traced their origins to the 12 legendary followers of Jesus. These were known simply as the 12. And they're manifestly based on the 12 tribes of Israel, and they're mythical figures. And their head was Peter, or Kephas in Aramaic, which means rock. And Kephas is a legendary figure also. He is the prophet, or the proto-prophet, who was imagined to have founded this sect, which itself imagined that Jesus passed esoteric teaching onto the 12. And the author of Mark rejects the authority of the 12 outright. His community clearly didn't believe in such a thing as the 12 before the rival gangs rolled into town. So he counters these groups very deliberately. But at the same time, their stories are quite compelling, quite powerful, certainly more advanced than anything Mark's community had been dealing with up to that point. And so he couldn't reject them outright. he appropriates and subverts them. Now, remember that the idea of the 12 came well before any written gospel, and its source is implied, like so many other early Christian beliefs, to be based on passages from the Old Testament. And the pre-existing myth of the 12 as it developed was that Jesus appeared to the 12, beginning with Cephas after his resurrection, and that he then in some way continued to appear to the miracle worker sect. Now, this same group also clashed with the Christianity of Paul, and I don't accept that Mark is a document that comes from Paul's religion. There are some similarities, but Paul is basically on a whole different wavelength than the rest of these guys. But these miracle workers clashed also with Paul, and in Paul's letters, they're called the super apostles. And the way that Paul's church fought back against them was to dispute their authority, kind of like, we're just as valid as you. It doesn't matter that Jesus appears to your guys every day. Our guy went up to frickin' heaven and spoke to the boss man directly and got marching orders from him. But Mark, on the other hand, fights back in a different way. He actually changes all the stories about Jesus and the 12 that he found in his tradition, and he makes it look like the 12 were rejected by the historical Jesus himself. And they, the miracle sect, would have no way to respond to this. They just have these silly, unconnected miracle stories. Mark was the first to write a full gospel story and narrative. And for them, it's like, sucks for you. You didn't think to write a full gospel before we did. And Mark does this in various ways. He does this by creating the empty tomb story, and also by emphasizing Jesus as a suffering servant Messiah, and also by putting the transfiguration story backward in time. And we'll talk more about that later, but he indeed depicts Jesus as a miracle worker, at least in the first half of the book. But the demons who recognize Jesus as the Son of God after he exorcises them are rebuked by him, and he tells them not to reveal his identity, as I said. And some believe that this literary device of Jesus telling the demons to shut up about his true nature was sort of an apologetic by the author to explain why Jesus only began to be known as the Messiah after his death. But Mark is not really having Jesus rebuke the demons as a means to keep his identity secret. It's actually a means by which Mark is refuting the very idea that the Messiah is manifested through signs and wonders. In other words, he's refuting the claims of the miracle worker sect, the super apostles. And he also refutes them by hitting them where it hurts, by destroying the legitimacy of the 12. Like I said, he rewrites, or actually writes, history in such a way that it seems that Jesus himself considered them, nothing more than a bunch of stewnods. And the Gospel of Mark is an angry polemic against the 12. And there are some who say that the Gospel of Mark is a document that came out of Paul's church, like I mentioned. And the first reason that they usually give is that, it maligns the 12. Well, yeah, but it's more complicated than that. And I think that Mark's religion and Paul's religion have a common ancestor, but Paul is basically off in the stratosphere compared to any of the Christians that we're talking about today. But anyway, in Mark's gospel, the 12 never understand Jesus, and they misconstrue his words and deeds. They deny him, abandon him, betray him. In the saddest performance of all, Peter pathetically renounces Jesus 3 times in a row after promising that he himself would stand by his master no matter what happened. There was that old tradition among the miracle worker sect that Jesus appeared to the 12 after his resurrection, and we see echoes of that elsewhere in Christian literature, like in 1 Corinthians 15, in a line that was added much later to that letter by Catholics. And as I mentioned earlier, Mark refutes that tradition by changing the story of that appearance and backdating it into the middle of Jesus's ministry. And he crafts a story of an epiphany on a mountaintop where God himself does a cameo and essentially gives the 12 one last chance to recognize the true messiahship of Jesus, the one that the author of Mark holds to, that of the suffering servant. The disciples, and especially Peter, are made to look like absolute fools here, and Peter can say nothing other than to offer to build tents for Jesus and his heavenly visitors. But by dismantling the legitimacy of his opponents, owning them, in fact, especially with that transfiguration story, Mark is not thereby denying that the miracles or the heavenly appearance actually happened. And he's not denying that the 12 existed, and he's not even denying that Jesus said something to the effect that he taught the 12 secret knowledge. And like I said, he can't get away with denying those things because now a good portion of his own community has actually come to believe them. they've come under the influence of his sectarian opponents. So, as is the standard operating procedure in Christian literature, including the Gospels, including Paul's letters, Mark accepts the traditions that he hates, but he subverts them, and he picks them up and he puts them down in a new context that better suits his apologetic needs. And we see this again and again in the Christian documents, like Acts of the Apostles is like a master class in that technique. It's just like what a friend of the show, Irenaeus, said. It's like a light, bright picture of a king, and you rearrange all the little lights so that it makes the picture of a dog in the same lights, different picture. Now, maybe he didn't say it in those exact terms, but what this all goes to show is that the traditions about Jesus are so unsubstantiated and so fluid in this early period that an author like Mark could apparently feel free to recontextualize them as needed. A case in point is that Mark basically invents the story of the denial of Peter, and he invents the story of the betrayal by Judas. And that's shown not only through a critical analysis of the text, but also by the fact that there is no evidence of such traditions prior to Mark's gospel. And even mainstream scholars are coming around more and more to that view, especially since like the 1980s. But what happens, Matthew comes along, and remember, according to scholars like Bart Ehrman, Matthew is supposed to have access to many more sources about the historical Jesus other than Mark. Yet when he's confronted with the story of Peter's denial or the betrayal by Judas, he knows something's wrong with them. Matthew has a lot of pro-Peter material that he wants to add to enhance Peter's reputation, not diminish it, but he's stuck with the bare fact that Mark's gospel says that Peter denied Jesus, and he has no alternative tradition that can supersede that. So he edits and clips down the story as best he can, adds his material that praises Peter, and ensures that there's a happy ending in which Peter and the remaining disciples meet the risen Jesus and get their marching orders from him. If Jesus was historical, if the disciples were historical, the 12, Mark would have had no call to play fast and loose with the tradition like he did, but suppose that he did it anyway and just got away with it. Well, in that case, the writers following him, Matthew, Luke, and John, who all had access to Mark's gospel, those writers would not have let those problematic stories and passages stand if they knew that they were untrue and if they had better or more complete knowledge about the life of Jesus. And it's not even like they didn't have sources that didn't conflict with Mark. They did. We know that both Matthew and Luke had access to a story in which Jesus promised that his disciples would judge the 12 tribes of Israel at the end of the world. So clearly whoever wrote that story didn't have any idea about a betrayal by Judas, which removes the number of apostles by one, and which is a thing that Mark invented. And Matthew and Luke had access to both that story and the stories in Mark, but they realized that Mark's was more complete and probably more popular, and they themselves had an embarrassing lack of material about the end of Jesus's life that could only be filled in with material from Mark, regardless of how badly it conflicted with either their sensibilities or their source material. So we discussed somewhat about the intention of Mark and the circumstances of its writing. It was basically a defense reaction, like an immunity response, cells of the body reacting against a virus, an effort to appropriate and subvert rival traditions about Jesus and put them in an acceptable framework that also firmly grounded the life and career of Jesus in the recent past. Mark used the stories told by his rivals to create this framework, but it's crucial to note that whenever Mark needed to fill in some missing information in his story, he raided the closet of the Old Testament and built his story out of components of the Old Testament using a technique called midrash. And he essentially rewrote these Old Testament stories essentially as building blocks for his story of Jesus, especially from the Elijah and Elisha cycle from 1st and 2nd Kings. And we'll talk about that specifically in a future show. But we turn now to address the date of this gospel. Back after this word. And now a reading from the Gospel of Mark, 120 AD. And he, going forth out of the temple, one of his learners says to him, "Teacher, see what kind of stones and what kind of buildings." And Jesus spoke to him, "Are you looking at these great buildings? There might never be left here a stone upon a stone which might never be torn down. That was a reading from the Gospel of Mark. And yeah, that is how Mark sounds when you read it literally. These are the words that Mark has Jesus say after he exits the Jerusalem temple. When he got there, he initially had stormed the court of the Gentiles, overturning tables, issuing curses, just generally behaving like a common ne'er-do-well. Now, despite the fact that action is probably in like the top 10 most disgraceful things that an individual person could ever manage to do in this place, the religious authorities are kind enough to let him hang out and deliver like an anti-Semitic TED Talk right at the Jerusalem temple, where he criticizes them even more, and then he's essentially allowed to leave unmolested. Now, as an aside, I strongly disagree, and it's the official position of this show that I disagree with the popular theory that Jesus was a revolutionary or zealot of some kind. And this temple cleansing is usually put forth as the main evidence of that. Well, that and the fact that he was crucified. And I would like any proponent of that theory to explain, if Jesus was a zealot, where do all of the many, many intervening gospel stories come from, like the ones between the temple storming and his death? Because there's quite a bit, and they all seem to come from similar writers. And all of those stories seem no less historically probable than the temple incident itself. In fact, if anything, it's probably more probable that a historical Jesus would have been just a gadfly wandering around the temple, issuing these gnomic sayings and criticisms of the religious order. Now, that's neither here nor there, but let's talk about his prediction that the Jerusalem temple would be destroyed. The Jewish state made a series of strategic choices in the 1st century BC that wound up with them being a client state of the Roman Empire by the beginning of the Common Era. Now, in actual fact, the traditional Jewish lands were ruled sometimes by a series of client kings, but sometimes the Romans ruled all or part of them directly, and they were divided on the map in various ways at various times. But it wasn't long before the people realized that being a client state of Rome essentially meant being a puppet state. It's a lesson that they could have learned from the Greeks that the Romans also conquered. But in any case, by the 60s AD, the whole region was under the direct rule of the Romans. But given the strong devotion of the 1st century Judeans to their national traditions, many of which were frankly incompatible with rule by the pagan empire, it was inevitable that situation would end decisively, and it did. And the war, the First Roman-Jewish War, from 66 to 73, was destructive and brutal. It was effectively over once the Romans recaptured Jerusalem in August of the year 70 AD, and for the most part leveled the Second Temple that dominated the city. It's called the Second Temple. The First Temple was the Solomonic Temple that's described in the Old Testament. This temple, the Second Temple, is the one that Jesus is referring to in the Gospel of Mark. Now, it's important to note that this passage is what's generally used by mainstream Christian scholars to assign a date to the Gospel of Mark. Because after Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, and after his disciples ask when it will happen, he gives, or at least appears to give, a speech that seems to reference the events of the First Roman-Jewish War. I mean, he says there'll be wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation, false messiahs, the abomination of desolation standing where it shouldn't be. When the inhabitants of Judea see it, they should flee to the mountains. And when you see it, don't go back to get anything from your house. It's kind of like an atomic bomb drill from the 50s. And pray that it may not happen in winter, because in those days there will be a tribulation that hasn't occurred since the beginning of creation. Well, I love it. Only problem is, it doesn't really seem to be describing the First Jewish War, which had a few big set-piece battles. But I mean, come on, this guy's talking about the sky being ripped apart, angels using the four winds like a vacuum cleaner. I mean, these are all apocalyptic tropes, to be sure, but the wording of the passage seems to militate against this being a description of the war. What's in fact far more likely is that this was just an independent apocalyptic document written by someone who did live through the war, and he punches up this mini apocalypse, or this apocalypse junior, as I like to call it, and really positioned it as like the end of the world will be like the Jewish war, but even bigger. And the document was clearly written for a Judean audience because it warns the people of Judea that they'll have to evacuate. Now, how much more effective would that warning be if it was written to people who had a living memory of a softer version of that had already happened? It's like, you remember how bad that was. This will be 1,000,000 times worse. And in fact, we see similar apocalyptic imagery in other documents written at the end of the first century, which is the date that I would tentatively give for this portion of Mark. Things like 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch, the earliest version of Revelation before the Christians got their hands on it. But the main thing is the passage that we just read, that is Mark 13, verses 1 and 2, are what in fact ties that apocalyptic section to the Jewish war. But those sentences need not have been part of the original composition. In other words, they were redacted in. And the form critics already pointed this out 100 years ago. And if those sentences are redacted in, then the apocalyptic section has no formal referent. And the Gospel of Mark itself is found to have no formal referent. What I mean is that Jesus says that the temple will be destroyed. Then his disciples ask when it will happen. Then he launches into the speech, which, like we said, is probably a prior apocalyptic document. Had that temple prediction not occurred before the apocalyptic speech, we would not have any way of tying the speech to the temple's destruction. So in other words, the prediction was written by Mark and placed very deliberately at the head of this apocalyptic speech content. And the reason why the Gospel of Mark is dated by scholars to the early 70s AD is that in their mind, whoever wrote these passages was experiencing the Jewish war while it was in full force, and he didn't know how it would turn out. And even as late as 73, 74, 75 AD, he had no idea that the situation in Judea would be relatively stable for another generation at least. Like, we know that, but the author didn't know that. For all he knew, the end of the world was still on offer. And in the passage, Jesus is made to say, this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. And scholars believe that he issued this speech in about 30 AD. And it's therefore reasonable to assume that he's talking about the generation of his listeners. If you're 30 years old listening to that speech, you'd be 70 at the time the events of the Jewish war happened. But if this speech was originally unattached to Jesus's prediction, then, like I said, neither the prediction nor the speech refer to one another. And that means that the speech need not refer to the events of 70 AD. It's a standalone apocalypse placed into the mouth of Jesus, whose sentences logically lead into one another for the most part, full of Old Testament references, quite uncharacteristic of the author of Mark, and interpolated with some Christian content. But its rhythm goes something like this. The end will come with a general war. The sign of the end will be the abomination of desolation. When that happens, take shelter as best you can. After the tribulation, there will be a great cataclysm. The Son of Man will come forth from the clouds with his angels. The elect will be saved. Watch for the signs of this happening. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Could just as well be an anonymous pamphlet by some madcap apocalyptic sectarian, and not out of place in the late 1st century. By the way, what is the abomination of desolation? No one knows. And to be frank, honestly, I don't think the author of that speech knew, let alone the author of Mark. He probably presumed that it referred to whatever the book of Daniel said, but I think we've lost our ability to do anything other than speculate on what that meant. I want to say something else, too, about those who push the date of the Gospel of Mark back even further into the 60s. And the logic here is that Mark knew there would be a war, and the war would be so destructive for the Jews that it would result in the temple being torn down. And if this were true, it would make the author of Mark one of the great clairvoyants of history. He can predict in no uncertain terms not only the outcome of the war that didn't even happen yet, but also the destruction of the temple, which was by no means a foregone conclusion even during the war. The most likely reason why the Romans destroyed the temple was that it ultimately was being used as a kind of citadel during the siege. But Mark is thought by these theorists as this to be this precognitive genius. He's out there short selling pigeons, and you wonder shouldn't he have warned his neighbors instead of sitting down to write this lengthy document that no one would read for 80 more years? And it's this is not how a document is dated. This is fuzzy thinking. And it sounds like it makes sense on paper, but as Hermann Dettering pointed out, the mainstream scholars don't even like to talk about the dating of these documents, and they come up with these semi-plausible narratives about a probable date, and then they quickly move on and discuss what they really want to discuss, when in fact the date of the document should be integral to how it's received. And yeah, it kind of makes sense to say that, well, the author of Mark knew that the war would be destructive, and he put this warning in the mouth of Jesus that encompassed his own predictions. And it's let's explore that further. before we run with it as the basis of dating this document. I mean, it's even been argued by some like Herman Dettering that this apocalyptic section could refer even to the Third Roman Jewish War, the Bar Kokhba rebellion of the 130s. Now, I myself don't hold to that, but there's nothing inherently implausible about it. But I think that overall, Mark here was trying to make a theological point and trying to instruct his readers about the nature of the end times, and merely used the equivalent of stock footage, like B-roll, to play underneath his commentary, which is that Jesus won't be present with the community until his return, which will come at the end of a tribulation. And all this goes to show that once you sever this passage, the Markan Apocalypse, from its referent, then you have lost the ability to firmly date this document in the 70s AD. And at that point, it's like what she said in the movie Jesus Camp. You've got a tiger by the tail, and you don't know which way is up. The first glimpse that we ever get of the Gospel of Mark being used or quoted is in the dialogue with Trypho by the theologian Justin Martyr, writing around 160 AD. Before this, there are echoes of gospel-like material being used in some of the Christian writings like the Didache, Barnabas, and so forth, but nothing concrete until we get to Justin, who speaks of the memoirs of the apostles. Now, Justin never attributes any of his quotes to a named author, his New Testament quotes. Whenever he gives us any gospel content, he only says that he's quoting the memoirs. He says it like 20 times, so much so, in fact, that it's likely that he was literally quoting from a book called The Memoirs of the Apostles, except for one time, when he in fact describes a story that only occurs in the Gospel of Mark. And he says to his fictional Jewish opponent, quote, "It's said that Jesus changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, and it's written in his memoirs that this happened, as well as that he changed the names of two brothers, the sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, which means sons of thunder," end quote. Now, when Justin says his memoirs, that's often taken to mean that he's quoting a document, in this case called the Memoirs of Peter. And what's interesting, though, is that when he brings this quote up, it's in the context of a long argument that he's been trying to make to the effect that every single sentence in Psalm 22 predicts Jesus. And in this specific case, he was talking about the line of the psalm that says, "I will declare your name to my brothers." But this is only scratching the surface of what Justin is trying to do here. Like I said, he's covering the entire Psalm 22. So it's worth thinking about whether he had the Gospel of Mark actually in front of him at this point, or whether he might not have in fact had some other Christian document which was like an analysis of Psalm 22 with just brief snippets of tradition appended to each line. Like it would have had a line from a psalm and then a section under that with a Christian commentary. And in this case, the line was, "I will declare your name to my brothers." And maybe in his book, the Christian commentary underneath it said, well, this happened when he changed one of his apostles' names to Peter, and also he changed these other guys' names to Boanerges. In other words, he didn't need to get this story directly from the Gospel of Mark. And that makes even more sense when you consider that he doesn't even say that he's getting it from a document called Mark. Rather, he says he's getting it from something either called the Memoirs of Peter or the Memoirs of Jesus, depending on how you read the Greek sentence. But as time goes by, we begin to see Mark quoted and discussed more and more. And there's a lost writing by a Christian named Papias, who wrote shortly after Justin. It's a lost book, but it's quoted by later authors. And it's here that we find the Christian church to have taken the first steps toward assigning the Gospel of Mark a time and a place in the tradition. Now, Papias knows the document called the First Letter of Peter, which he, of course, believes was written by Peter. And in that, the author introduces a companion named Mark. And later in his book, Papias gives us some more important info about this man named Mark that Peter mentioned. Quote, "The elder would say that Mark, who had become the interpreter of Peter, wrote accurately, yet not in order, as many things as he remembered of the things either said or done by the Lord. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him. But later, as I said, Peter, who would make the teachings to the needs, but not making them as an ordering together of the lordly oracles, so that Mark did not sin, having thus written certain things as he remembered them. For he made one provision, to leave out nothing of the things that he heard or falsify anything in them. That translation is based on Ben C. Smith's, and I think it's a useful one because that passage is one of the most quoted in the study of Christian origins, and that translation goes to show just how garbled and confusing it is. But Papias here seems to be talking about our Gospel of Mark, if we read this literally. But in fact, we have no idea what the hell he was talking about here. I mean, he says first that Mark wrote down all the things that Jesus said and did, but then later we're told that he only wrote what Jesus said. It's possible that he was confused, Papias, that was referring to some document that was attributed to Mark, but maybe it's not the same as our canonical Mark. But if we assume that he is talking about the canonical Mark, then if I understand him correctly, he's actually criticizing the Gospel of Mark, like kind of damning it with faint praise. Like, yeah, it's good, I guess. Like, if you like things that suck. Like he says it's out of order. I think that whoever wrote this passage also was the person who edited the Gospel of Luke in like the 160s. In fact, I think that Luke was finalized right around this time, like the late 160s. And it's uncanny that just like this writer, if we want to call him Papias or whatever, the author of the Gospel of Luke also knows about previous attempts to write the history of Jesus. And he also points out the fact that unlike those, his version is going to be in proper order. So it's something to think about. Now, if you notice, sometimes I pedantically pronounce words in their original languages, but I make an exception for some words and names. Like Papias, for example, I use the anglicized pronunciation for his name, even though I always felt that it kind of sounds like a failed note-taking app that would get like 1-star reviews on the App Store, kind of like a bad note-taking app for your phone. I don't know, Papias. Now, Clement of Alexandria, writing at the end of the 2nd century from Egypt in another lost book, repeats what Papias said, although he adds that after Peter finished preaching, Peter's audience begged Mark to leave them a written record of the preaching. And it says that they had to convince him repeatedly until he finally gave in. Sounds like quite the prima donna. But it says that after Mark finished writing the gospel, Peter learned of it through a revelation of the Spirit, and he basically gave his approval to the book. Now, this seems to essentially be an elaboration of the same thing that Papias said, but I want to point out one thing. You can tell that this is a fake legend from the fact that the writer is very reluctant to put Peter in direct contact with Mark's gospel, because in the last quarter of the 2nd century, there were a lot of legends about Peter being written, a lot of potentially conflicting legends about his whereabouts. Some people were putting him in Rome, some putting him in Antioch. They were elaborating the legend of his death, like they weren't sure whether he founded the church in Rome and died after that, or whether he founded the church in Rome with Paul or without Paul, and then went elsewhere and then came back. The same thing with Mark. The legend was being developed at this time that he had like a secondary career as Bishop of Alexandria. So the writer of this legend in Clement is very reluctant to blow up the spot of any of these other writers of these legends. So he kind of sets his origin story for the Gospel of Mark in outer space. It's like Mark wrote it at some place and time, and sometime afterward, Peter, who was in some undisclosed location, like in the Hellenistic NORAD bunker, he gave his approval. Now, the author of the Acts of the Apostles does the same thing, by the way. He just yanks Peter off the stage with a cane, when Peter is no longer needed in his narrative. And then he decides later that, like, oh shit, I actually did need Peter. And he randomly brings him back for like one passage, back in Acts 15. And again, Clement here seems like he's damning Mark's gospel with faint praise. It's like, well, good, but not great. Like Mark did a decent job and Peter signed off on it. I think here Clement was following Papias, like I said, but I think he just was unsatisfied with Papias' wording. So he just made some quick alterations. Now, sometime later, probably in the 3rd century, we get yet another legend of how Mark was written. And this one courtesy of the Latin prologues to the Gospels that are found in some manuscripts. And the one before the Gospel of Mark says this, quote, Mark made his account, Mark who was also named Stubby Fingers, because he had shorter fingers compared to the rest of his body. He was a disciple and interpreter of Peter, whom he followed just as he heard him report. When he was requested at Rome by the brethren, he briefly wrote this gospel in parts of Italy. When Peter heard this, he approved and affirmed it by his own authority for the reading of the church. After the departure of Peter, this gospel, which he himself put together having been taken up, he went away into Egypt and, ordained as the first bishop of Alexandria, announcing Christ, he constituted a church there. It was of such teaching and continence of life that it compels all followers of Christ to imitate its example. Acknowledging Ben C. Smith again for the translation there, and this version clearly comes later than the other two. By the way, I like to read these out just if for no other reason than to have provide more context and to let people have something to come back to when they re-listen to the show and they want to know exactly what the wording of these passages sounds like. Now, this version follows the other two legends, but adds details. And first of all, stubby fingers, and that comes from a Greek word, kolobodaktylos, and that could possibly refer to a man who cut off his thumb to escape being drafted into the Roman military. But there was also a theory that Mark received this derisive nickname because his gospel cuts off the resurrection stories in which Jesus actually appears to the disciples. That's a fun theory, but probably as with all of these legends, it's just based on nothing. This writer adds some details, like he cleans up the timeline of Peter approving the gospel. Like now it makes somewhat more sense. Peter catches wind of it this time. It's not so magical anymore. And he adds at the end there that Mark went back to his home planet. Friend of the show, Hippolytus, by the way, writing in the 3rd century, also knows the stubby fingers legend. No one before these two has ever heard it, though. And this brings us to the very first writer to both unambiguously quote from the Gospel of Mark and actually attribute it to Mark. And for those keeping score at home, we find once again that Irenaeus, writing at the end of the 180s AD, is the first to quote and to attribute another New Testament document. And he knows the writings of Papias, and he gives this origin story for Mark. Matthew issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, handed down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. End quote. Irenaeus is what we would call today a bureaucratic infighter. He's a survivor, basically, a master of office politics. And his interest is in giving the New Testament documents legitimacy. In fact, it's he who introduced the New Testament to the world and maybe even compiled it. But he's not interested in going any further than that. All he'll say is Mark wrote his gospel. It's one of the 4 legitimate ones, and he wrote it with the full sanction of Peter. And notice here how he doesn't hedge and say, well, Peter approved it later, or Mark had to be begged to write it by some thirsty congregants. No. Mark wrote down the preaching of Peter, full stop, no more and no less. Irenaeus also says something interesting about the Gospel of Mark, which might give us a clue as to why he didn't delve too deeply into its origins. And he basically says that it's among the favorite Gospels that are used by heretics in his time. But on the subject of Mark being a record of Peter's preaching, in preparation for this show, I read an apologetics website that not only agreed that the Gospel of Mark is a record of Peter's preaching, but also they made the specific claim that Mark made 50 copies of Peter's preaching, and he kind of fashioned his gospel out of that. And I spent about an hour searching for every permutation of this legend, like I did, like Mark plus Peter plus 50 copies, or like Mark plus gospel plus 50. But the only results I would ever get is just like the one dumbass site that claimed it in the first place, plus a message from the search engine that was like, we're not finding too many results for your query. Like I searched for it so many times that they made me do one of these bot checks. Like I had to fill out a CAPTCHA. I mean, it just goes to show the kind of misinformation that's floating out on these apologetics websites. Like imagine someone who didn't know anything about early Christianity reading that and being influenced by it. Well, I guess I should be the one to talk when it comes to that, right? But what have we learned? We've learned that the Gospel of Mark was supposedly based on the preaching of Peter and that Peter endorsed it at a later time. And what is this based on? I hate to be the one to say this, but it's based on nothing. Because in the development that we've traced here, this is basically a game of telephone that originated with Papias. And we saw that Justin around the year 160 doesn't know that this passage comes from a book called Mark. It's Papias who first makes the connection. And crucially, he does this because the document is actually associated with Peter in the tradition. And that's how Justin received the document. But the problem is that at this time, there was already a Gospel of Peter. And Justin also uses that book too, although he doesn't call it that. But by the time of Papias, the church, for one reason or another, maybe because the Gospel of Peter cast too long of a shadow, couldn't afford to say outright that the gospel that we're talking about today was actually the work of Peter. And Justin's telling it was the memoirs of Peter. So Papias made a connection based on the first letter of Peter that appears in our New Testament, where he makes mention of a guy named Mark. that this Mark would be the next logical person who would have written down any sort of memory or recollection of Peter. And it's kind of a shame that he chose the name Mark, because he blew our best chance of getting the Gospel according to Silvanus. But the view of the Gospel of Mark that we get, that it was written by a companion of Peter close to the life of Jesus, is shown here to be a fiction based on guesswork. Yet that traditional view, that ancient view, continues to inform modern-day studies of this document. And I mean, the thinking is that this tradition had to be based on something. The church couldn't have just made it up out of whole cloth. Oh yeah, they could. We'll be back with more after this word. The vast majority of scholars place the Gospel of Mark from the end of the 60s AD to the end of the 70s AD. But we do get outliers, conservatives, fundamentalists, of course, want to place it as close to the life of Jesus as possible. So you get dates like one Christian apologist website that I saw, which said 45 AD, which is about the most insane thing I've ever heard. Now, on the high end, I didn't find many second century dates. The more critical scholars tend to put Mark later in the first century. So people like Earl Doherty, Edgar Goodspeed, Alfred Loisy might place it around 90 to 100 AD or so. Robert M. Price is open to placing it in the second century. And there are some like St. Eddy, Charles Waite, Bruno Bauer, and so forth, who would put it after 150 AD. I generally tend to disagree with such a late date, unless you're talking about like its absolute final form. And I'll get into the reasons why in a bit. Now, I honestly believe that one of the reasons that Mark is placed so early is, like I said, the modern scholars are under the influence of the ancient tradition that the Gospel of Mark is a record of the preaching of Peter. And I'll never get tired of saying that if in other disciplines such a shady, baseless tradition would have been discarded a long time ago, in New Testament scholarship, the facts are often arranged to fit the tradition. Because in many cases, these shadowy, nebulous traditions and legends are all they have to go by. And I would liken it to Mormon scholars, who investigate the historicity of the Book of Mormon. Now, the Book of Mormon essentially claims that ancient Israelites sailed to Mesoamerica 4,000 years ago and encountered some American natives. I mean, it's like preposterous on its face. Joseph Smith claimed that at a time when archaeology didn't really exist as such. It was like still in its early infancy. But these scholars, Mormon scholars, like reputable, smart people, will insist that this or that step pyramid, this or that grass tomb indicates the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And what do we know? Like, we're not scholars who have spent 8 years studying the necessary languages. We've never been at a dig site. We can't read Mayan. We can't read the reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics or whatever. So what right do we have to question it? And we see the same routine used by New Testament scholars as well. I mean, it's frustrating to read a detailed, in-depth study of the Gospels by someone like B.H. Streeter, who ends up saying that, yeah, Papias was right. This could very well have been written by a companion of Peter. And they wouldn't say that at all if the church tradition didn't indicate that. But because the church tradition did indicate that, they're stuck. I mean, they have to account for it in one way or another. And they decide to validate that tradition for two reasons. One, if they didn't, they would have nothing else with which to navigate this utter chaos of texts. And the second reason is, if you decide not to accept this piece of Christian tradition over here, but you accept this piece of Christian tradition over here, then again, you've got a tiger by the tail, because the same critical analysis that tells you that such and such a bit of Christian tradition is worthless could just as well be applied to render worthless every piece of ancient Christian tradition, because they're all equally unsubstantiated. For 1,800 years, the universal belief of Christendom has been that the Gospel of Mark is in one way or another based on the preaching of Peter. And whether that assertion is buried under pages of econometric data from first century Galilee or some kind of genre critique of Greco-Roman rhetorical conventions, the fact remains that the ancient tradition is lurking just under the waters, no matter where you look. Now, I want to briefly talk about the earliest physical evidence for Mark. I mean, the earliest manuscript evidence. Like, what is the earliest copy of Mark, or any portion of it, that we can actually hold in our hands? I don't mean that literally. Like, if you wanted to hold it in your actual hands, you'd have to be like Indiana Jones, like swapping it out so you didn't activate the laser tripwire or whatever. It's kept under glass and shown to the public 3 times per century. or kept in some rich psycho's cryo-tomb. But for a while, the apologists were claiming that the earliest copy of Mark was a scrap of crumbling papyrus called 7Q5. It's a Dead Sea Scroll, and its name means that it was the fifth manuscript found in the Cave 7 of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And it's a piece of paper the size of a stamp with about 50 letters written on it. And at some point, a Christian scholar decided that 10 of those 50 letters corresponded to part of 2 sentences in the Gospel of Mark. And I won't go into too much detail on 7Q5 here, other than the fact that, needless to say, I don't agree that it's part of the Gospel of Mark, and neither does hardly anyone else. But I bring it up here to demonstrate that there isn't any physical Christian evidence at all from the first century. I repeat, there is no Christian evidence from the first century, and that includes tombs, epitaphs, manuscripts, grave goods, shopping lists, emails, sex toys. And this is something that has obsessed the more conservative scholars in the past. And so they find first century Christian evidence where there isn't any. The Anexamenos Graffito, the Sator Square, some indistinct scrawls in a building in Pompeii, and 7Q5, the supposed earliest manuscript of Mark. It's difficult to tell what this document even says, let alone that it comes from a known document, and let alone the Gospel of Mark. And speaking of the Dead Sea Scrolls, if we were all living in the 1950s right now, and the Dead Sea Scrolls had recently been uncovered, and I was recording this same show over the wireless or the Voice of America or whatever, I would be completely confident, even before the scrolls were translated, that they did not mention Christianity, let alone include any Christian text or even reference any Christian figures, any controversy that this community had with Christians. And remember that the last of the Dead Sea Scrolls date from about 68 AD or so. I'm not at all surprised that the Dead Sea Scrolls ended up not containing any reference to Christianity, because Christianity is fundamentally a second century phenomenon. Now, in the same way, a few years ago, I clearly remember hearing rumblings that a team of Christian archaeologists had uncovered a manuscript of the Gospel of Mark that was dated to the first century. And I clearly remember talking on the phone to my friend Martin, with whom I discuss a lot of this stuff, and I said, I guarantee that manuscript doesn't date to the first century. And that's how it turned out. So about 10 years ago, the internet started rumbling with these claims about a first century manuscript of Mark. And the people who actually had access to the manuscript weren't making any specific claims about what it said, which is a major red flag right from the start. And the manuscript was evidently sold to Hobby Lobby, which, for those not in the American South, is like this craft store ruled by fundamentalists. Now, recall that most New Testament manuscripts are dated according to their writing style, as paleography, which is somewhat more art than science. But this supposed first century Mark, this Hobby Lobby grifter porn, was later re-examined and placed in the eminently more sensible late 2nd century, early 3rd century. Now, if a first century Mark was discovered and proved to be legitimate, I would not only cancel this show going forward, but I would leave all extant episodes up for posterity so that all future generations could see how owned I was. And I would go to Hobby Lobby headquarters and kneel down and sprinkle ashes on my head for the rest of my life. But I'm confident that I won't have to do that. And the reason is that I'm strongly convinced that Mark is a 2nd century text. Looking for a first century Mark is like looking for a 19th century Volkswagen. It doesn't exist. And I want to reiterate, no first century Christian manuscripts have ever been found. And even the 2nd century manuscripts, like the earliest one is supposed to be 125 AD, it's questionable that they date even that early, because dating them is not an exact science. But I'm more than willing to accept a late 2nd century date for a gospel manuscript, but first century is out of the question, and the lack of archaeological evidence supports me. Now, if you accept the new date that the scholars gave to the Hobby Lobby grifter manuscript, then this manuscript would in fact be the earliest manuscript of Mark, and dating between 150 AD and 250 AD. It consists of part of the story of Jesus' baptism, as well as Jesus' calling of Peter and Andrew as disciples. And before that, the earliest manuscript of Mark was considered to be P45, which is from the 3rd century, and that includes Mark chapters 4 through 9 and 11 through 12. Back after this word. I want to address the argument that's usually given against dating the Christian documents in the 2nd century, and that is that if the documents were that late, like say they were written in 150 AD, then there would be a much higher likelihood that the author would slip and would reference something that had happened in that time frame, in that intervening period. But I'm going to tell you why this argument doesn't actually work when it comes to the Gospels. The Gospels studiously avoid mentioning historical events of any kind to begin with. Like if we knew nothing about the 1st century, which is the time in which the Gospel of Mark is actually sent, what would we learn about it if we only had Mark as a source? The only time cues that we get are the fact that Herod is in charge of Galilee, and that family there was a bunch of people named Herod, and Pilate is in charge of Judea in some fashion. And he's not even called Pontius Pilate in Mark's Gospel. There are no external historical events that are referenced. The narrative takes place. It's like trying to remember what happened last night when you were drunk. Like the healings could conceivably take place in the 21st century, let alone the 1st. There's nothing that specifically binds them to that time frame. And most of the stories themselves are constructed out of Old Testament building blocks to begin with. I mean, the Elijah and Elisha cycle that Mark is based on does take place in a specific time period, but it's not so concerned with giving an exact chronology. I mean, this is sacred history. And think of everything that was going on in the 20s and 30s AD, like the court drama with Tiberius and whatnot, like wars going on in Germania, wars in Numidia, Thrace, a massive tragedy in Fidenae, a big fire in Rome, the deaths of all kinds of famous Roman politicians and writers throughout the whole empire, including the East. None of that stuff is referenced in the text that we have, and we shouldn't expect it to be. So if the Gospel of Mark was written in 120 AD, we shouldn't expect that the author would reference things from, let's say, 30 all the way up to 120. But I mean, for all that, he kind of does. I mean, he does appear to allude to the First Roman-Jewish War of 70 AD when he does like the parable of the wicked tenants. And there are a lot of anachronisms in the text as it stands, given the very limited historical information that we do get. Added to which the gospel authors are not stupid. Like, they know how to set a story in the past. Now, Mark takes the extreme measure of hardly referencing any external synchronisms, but he's not dumb enough to have like the high priest checking his wristwatch during the trial of Jesus. Hey, can we get on with this? Like, there's a James Bond marathon on TNT that I'm missing. But I mentioned anachronisms, and we're going to go over 7 key anachronisms of the Gospel of Mark. Now, the first thing that anyone should do who wants to learn about the historical background of the Gospel of Mark is to check out the Michael Turton website, Turton. And this is an analysis that literally goes line by line and seeks to determine the historicity of the entire book. I made this episode with one eye on Michael Turton's analysis, but we're prepared to go even further than him in a lot of places, even as he does conclude that it's possible that Mark was written in the early 2nd century. He points out some anachronisms in Mark that I wanted to address and amplify and add to. First of all, the Pharisees. The Pharisees are treated in the Gospel of Mark like the 1st century religious police stalking the landscape, like Committee for the Preservation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. And this was not and could not have been the case in the early 1st century. There are traditions to the effect that the Pharisees took command of Judaism shortly after the destruction of the temple, and by the early 90s AD, they were already expelling Christians from the synagogues with the 12th of the 18 prayers of the benedictions, the Birchat Haminim. It says, "May the Nazarenes and the schismatics perish as in a moment. Let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be written with the righteous. You are praised, O Lord, who subdues the arrogant." End quote. But there's no proof that that prayer is from the 1st century or even the late 1st century like the tradition says. On the contrary, it's not attested until the late 3rd century. Now, Justin Martyr in the 150s says that the Pharisees cursed the Christians in their synagogues, but when he's talking about the Pharisees, he's talking about the rabbis, the proto-rabbis of his own time. And when the Christian documents describe Pharisees, and when Mark and Matthew in particular describe them, they are referring to the proto-rabbis of their time, and that is the time period between the destruction of the temple and the time period of Justin Martyr. That is 70 through 150 AD. And by the way, the title of rabbi is used like multiple times in this gospel, a complete anachronism for the 1st century, like let alone the early 1st century. Another big anachronism in Mark is this whole idea of persecution. And the Gospel of Mark is heavily concerned with persecution, even in innocuous little passages like the parable of the sower. They assume that Christians are being persecuted. And what that means is They are an identifiably separate religious group from their surrounding environment if they're being persecuted. Quote, "And other seed fell onto the rocky place where it didn't have much earth, and it sprang up straight away because it didn't have a depth of earth." End quote. And Jesus refers to these as being the people who abandon the word once they are persecuted. And persecution is a major concern to Mark. And in fact, in Mark, Jesus himself is portrayed as kind of a model Christian who gets persecuted and goes willingly to his ransoming death. When early Christian documents like Mark talk about persecution, you shouldn't imagine these stereotypical scenes of Christians pursued by wild beasts in the amphitheater. It could be something as simple and as low-key as their neighbors or their fellow synagogue members ratting them out to the town's head man or whatever. Persecution in Mark seems to be linked more so with the idea of losing family members and friends, like ruining your relationships with them. So this is something likely happening on a local level. And again, in these Christian documents that mention persecution, we should always consider the possibility that the people persecuting them are rival Christian groups, like engaging in fistfights with them. Like, we don't take kindly to your kind around here, things like that. And, the fact that persecution is being so heavily emphasized assumes that the continuum of development, that is Christianity as being distinct from its surroundings and distinct from Judaism, has progressed along much further than we would expect if this document was still being written at the time of the Jewish War. Another anachronism has to do with the relationship that this community appears to have with Jews, like mainstream Judaism. There's a comment that Mark makes. He says that the Pharisees and all the Jews don't eat unless they wash their hands with the fist. I mean, this implies that he sees Jews as a completely separate entity from his own community. And that split between Judaism and Christianity didn't happen overnight, like the New Testament wants us to think. Christianity was basically percolating since 70 AD as the beginnings of a kind of sect within Judaism. And it would take a long time for Jews to even notice that these people actually believed something substantially different than what they believed. And again, Jewish documents from around 100 AD, like 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, that I seem to always be mentioning in every show, no awareness of Christians in those documents. And for a situation like the Gospel of Mark, where the author is inveighing against the Jews, we're looking at least 115, 120. And like I said, I think it was the Kitos War that inspired the pull reaction here. It's not just that Mark is trying to answer criticisms from Jews, but he's also trying to differentiate his group from Jews, which the Romans are associating with this giant rebellion. But this process is still at an early stage when compared with Matthew and Luke. And that's why I think the Kitos War is the ideal time setting for this, and not the later Bar Kokhba War. And it couldn't have been the 70 AD war because Christianity was not logically possible before then. Another example of how Mark is at the beginning of that differentiation process between Christians and Jews is that in his gospel, Jesus still includes the word Israel when reciting the Shema prayer. Be hearing, O Israel, Lord our God is one Lord. He says that to the man who asked, what's the greatest commandment? And Matthew, writing about 10, 15 years later, he keeps everything else, but he whacks that part out, which is like the crucial part. Mark's not yet prepared for such a clean break between Christianity and Judaism. He's probably one of the first people to realize that the break is coming, but he's not quite sure how to articulate it. Another anachronism, the author knows a late legend about the martyrdom of James and John, and Jesus chidingly says to them that they will drink the cup that he drinks. And this is a reference to the fact that Mark, quote unquote, knows that these two members of the 12 were executed in a persecution. And now the 12 in general were not really fully hashed out by the time Mark wrote his gospel. And that really wouldn't come until way later in the Apocryphal Acts. What we had by Mark's time was a set of conflicting legends about Cephas or Peter, the knowledge that he was associated with a brother named Andrew, and also legends about John, who was also associated with a brother who later was given the name James. It's possible that the name John ultimately came from the book of Revelation, or the same community that wrote the Christian version of that book, which is in modern Bibles. And the legend was that John had suffered in a persecution, and his brother was also assigned the same fate. And Mark's community knows that legend, so he kind of lampshades it here. He's not willing to give much more than the barest allusion to their death, which is a sign that the tradition wasn't fully fleshed out yet. And the characters were not really given their backstories till the 170s, 180s, and later. Another anachronism in Mark is the portrayal of Galilee as being a place full of synagogues in the early 1st century. Now, the question of whether synagogues existed anywhere in the region during this period is a controversial one, and those were, more properly speaking, a diaspora thing. There's really little evidence for synagogues, even within Palestine as a whole, for this period. A few sites are usually identified and argued over. There's also the possibility that there were tiny house synagogues that were built over later on and left few remains, but synagogues are more closely associated with Galilee once we get to the 2nd century. And to Mark, Galilee is absolutely loaded with synagogues. The very first thing that Jesus does in his career is go into a synagogue and heal someone. It then says that he goes to synagogues all throughout Galilee doing the same thing. He heals a man with a withered hand in a synagogue later on. After that, a synagogue official asks him to save his daughter's life. The scribes are said to prefer the chief seats in the synagogues. You will be flogged in synagogues for my sake. I'm really getting the sense this guy thinks that there were synagogues. In any case, a situation that matches the 2nd century better than the first. The next anachronism is pretty much a smoking gun. Quote, "Whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in a name that you are Christ's will not lose his reward." End quote. In a name that you are Christ's, sometimes translated as your name as followers of Christ. What the author is trying to do here is give a circumlocution for the term Christian. And it absolutely goes without saying that Jesus, who is rarely, if ever, referred to as the Christ in the Gospel of Mark, and in fact never refers to himself that way directly, would not have said that his immediate followers identify themselves in the name of Christ. And the author seems to recognize that, so he does this very awkward paraphrase. He wants to say that anyone who is a self-identifying Christian is worthy of aid, but he seems to be aware that Jesus would not or could not have used the actual term Christian. Now, you might say, well, there would have been Christians by 70 AD if we're going by the traditional timeline. Jesus died in 30 AD, and sure, he wasn't using the term Christian during his lifetime, but it could have come into being by 70 AD. Except there's a problem with that, which is that the word Christian, or any of its variants, is usually a sign of a mid-2nd century or later document. In the New Testament itself, only 1 Peter and the book of Acts use the term, and I would place both of those after 150, but in the non-biblical Christian writings, even in the mid-2nd century, there is a reluctance to embrace the term Christian. I mean, it was quite a process, because Christian, like most words that describes a sect, was originally an insulting exonym. Technically it's supposed to mean messianist, but to Greek and Latin speakers, non-Jews, it would have sounded like you were calling these people the wet ones or something, since the word Christos or oil was most often used in the context of anointing, like for athletics, wrestling, and so on. And it seems like all such exonyms and things like Quakers, Diggers, Puritans, to have been at first rejected and then later accepted by the people it was directed against. And so we see in the middle of the 2nd century still that Christians are having a hard time accepting this title, and they try to justify it in various ways. And like Tatian, a Christian writer from the 160s, does an entire defense of the religion, against paganism, never once uses the term. The Didache, a church manual probably from the 130s, uses it only once and seems incredibly reluctant to use it when it does so. And Justin Martyr in the 150s seems to suggest that the term Christian actually comes from Christos, or excellent. And in fact, Theophilus of Antioch, all the way in the 180s, is still embarrassed by the term Christian, and he tries to flip that embarrassment back on his accuser. And he says, quote, "You laugh at me and call me a Christian. You don't know what you're saying, because what's anointed is sweet and serviceable and far from contemptible. We are called Christians for this reason, because we are anointed with the oil of God." End quote. And actually, no, that's not why you're called Christians, Theophilus. St. Eddie pointed out that the term Christian was a term of abuse in the early church, whose members were usually called saints, brothers, the elect. He refers to it as the vulgar scoff name, Christiani. And now the final major anachronism in Mark, the possible use of the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus. Josephus wrote 2 or 3 major works, depending on how you're counting, and these were written between the 80s AD and the first decade of the 2nd century. Now, it seems most probable that Mark made use of the Josephus book Antiquities of the Jews, which was published in the early 90s AD. Now, Josephus is a massive subject for us on this show. We can let it suffice to say here that it's at least possible that Mark may have used this book not only to set the stage for his narrative, but also he borrowed or adapted some stories from Josephus. Now, I tend to think that Josephus was actually the primary source for all the Christian writers because when I say that, I mean he was the source for the historical period in general. Because when they looked back to the first century Judea as a backdrop for their stories, they only saw a blank slate. It was Josephus who provided them with the skeleton of that history. Like I think, for example, that Pontius Pilate, for example, who looms so large in the New Testament, I think that the Christian authors decided to set Jesus' life in history at that time because of what they learned about Pilate from reading Josephus. And Michael Turton identifies a few possible places where Mark may have borrowed from Josephus. And first of all, Josephus describes a miracle conducted by an exorcist named Eleazar. And the wording of that story is at least reminiscent of the Capernaum exorcism story about Jesus. At another point, Jesus exorcises an entire legion of demons and sends it into a herd of pigs, which rush into a nearby lake and are drowned. And Josephus has a passage about a rebel named Jesus. In fact, there are like 80 Jesuses in his books. A rebel named Jesus whose army was chased into a lake and cut down by the armies of Titus. The language of the Apocalypse Junior that we talked about also has a lot in common with passages in Josephus about the devastation of the Roman-Jewish war. Josephus depicts various would-be messiahs as launching their efforts from the Mount of Olives, just as Jesus does. And the Transfiguration story in Mark, where Jesus is seen in a luminous cloud on a holy mountain, accompanied by Moses and Elijah, that may borrow from the story in Josephus about Moses in the presence of the elders of Israel, including Eleazar and Joshua, which is the same name as Jesus. And Mark's gospel ends with Jesus being buried in a cave for 3 days. Well, actually two days basically, but they claim that it's 3. Technically to us, it'd be more like 1 day. And his resurrection is discovered by women. Josephus in his books describes hiding out in a cave after the Battle of Jotapata during the First Roman-Jewish War and being found by a woman after 3 days. And then from there, Josephus ingratiated himself with the soon-to-be Emperor Vespasian, and his career got made after that, kind of like Jesus ascending to the right hand of the Father after his resurrection. That was something pointed out by the scholar Cliff Carrington. It's a bit of a stretch, but we are indebted to Michael Turton for listing these possible Josephus parallels. Some of them I didn't even actually use here because I don't think that it's the strongest argument that there is, the idea that Mark used Josephus. But I personally have a strong suspicion that it may have been the case that he used it for nothing else than for his world building. So we've identified 7 major anachronisms in Mark before we ever even did a close reading. And we'll do that too in the coming months. But we'll be back after this word. Something interesting happens while Jesus is on the way to getting crucified. He's been mocked by the soldiers, then he's led out, and then we get this. And they pressed into service a passerby, a certain Simon, a Cyrenian, the father of Alexandros and Rufus, coming in from a field in order that he might lift his cross. End quote. A scholar of Christian origins named Ben C. Smith pointed out that the author of Mark seems to assume that his readers will know just who Alexander and Rufus are. These are the names that he gives as the sons of Simon of Cyrene. Simon of Cyrene is a creation of Mark. He is placed here in this passion narrative by Mark. And in no other Christian source do we hear of Simon of Cyrene except in texts that are specifically following the passion narrative of Mark. But Mark is unique in that it's the only text to mention Alexander and Rufus. And no one has ever come up with a convincing explanation as to why Mark names Alexander and Rufus here and assumes that his readers will know who they are. But the consensus today among apologists, at least, just so happens to agree with the traditional view of the early church, which is that Mark is intimating here that the account of this incident of Simon carrying Jesus' cross comes from Simon's sons, who are implied to be the eyewitness sources of this account. But we may rightfully question why exactly it is that Mark decides to support this part of the narrative with an eyewitness account when By his reckoning, the entire Passion has about 1 trillion witnesses, including many who seem to accompany Jesus from the time he was led out until the time he was buried. And why does he feel the need to source this particular part of the narrative? Let's look at the things that happen specifically in this little section, which many believe was redacted in by Mark. In other words, if he was following a source for his Passion narrative, he himself is responsible for this passage about Simon, the carrying the cross, and Alexander and Rufus. I want to draw your attention to something that Jesus said earlier, directly after he rebuked Peter for having the wrong understanding of his messiahship. He said, "If anyone wants to follow me, let him disown himself and lift his cross and follow me. Whoever might want to save his soul will lose it, but whoever loses his soul for my sake and that of the gospel will save it." That was an independent saying from the tradition that Mark incorporated here, and his point, he's criticizing those who have a more exalted idea of the Messiah. His point is that following Jesus entails humility. Now, two things are said about Simon in this passage. One is that he was coming in from the fields, and remember that this is the day of preparation. The Sabbath is a few hours away. The Jewish day begins at nightfall, basically. Simon's getting in ahead of it. He's a pious Jew. And secondly, he's said to be from Cyrene, i.e. northeastern Libya. It's where Benghazi is now. It was the primary flashpoint of the Quitos War. And the rebellion that was felt in some way in all the major cities of the East that had Jewish populations, the rebellion that caused unrest, that put the squeeze on Mark's own community, I would submit to you that Alexander and Rufus are the names of prominent rebels who claimed lineal descent from the zealot leaders in the First Jewish War, and they are in some way viewed unfavorably by Mark's community. It could be that the local Jewish synagogues are led by Alexander and Rufus, or were led by them in the previous generation, and the fallout from the war is causing issues between these synagogues and Mark's church. And what Mark does is to neutralize, at least in the eyes of his own community, neutralize the claims of Alexander and Rufus by creating a backstory for them, in which they were the sons not of a rabble-rousing messianist, not of a zealot, but of a humble servant, a pious Jew, and a docile man who exemplified the character of the ideal Christian servant, albeit against his will. And we can see at least how this would really take the wind out of the sails of Alexander and Rufus, at least among Mark's own fellow Christians, because now they're armed with a story to deploy against the followers of Alexander and Rufus. It's like those two men and their followers know that the story is complete BS. It doesn't change their mind in any way. But the next time they try to convince one of these early Christians to follow them, that Christian is now armed with an apologetic. Now he can say, well, these guys' father actually humbled himself. He in some way recognized the true Messiah, the suffering Messiah, and the one that makes you humble yourself to follow him. Now, that man was compelled to do that, so it's not like he deserves any great credit. But certainly his sons Alexander and Rufus don't deserve any credit. And in fact, their claims to leadership should be investigated. Give them a second look. That's what the Christians could say. And for me, it's the key word of Cyrene, which was the major hotspot of the Quitos War, that really informs this theory about Alexander and Rufus and why they're mentioned. Now, this is all eminently unfalsifiable, but as you can see, it does have heavy implications for dating this document. And the author of Mark pulls something like this elsewhere. He has James and John ask Jesus for the privilege of sitting on his right and on his left when he comes into his glory. He denies them, like the Markan Messiah should. He basically says that sitting on his right or left is a privilege granted only by his Father, which is implied to be God. And then James and John go away. I guess they're satisfied with that answer, even though Jesus essentially also predicts their deaths in that passage. You'd think they'd be a little spooked by that and want some clarifying information, but they just disappear off stage. But then later, when Jesus is crucified, the author tells us that two thieves were crucified with him, one on his right, one on his left. He uses the exact same language that he used earlier in the segment about James and John begging him for positions of privilege and glory. And so it's just like what he does with Simon of Cyrene. The true discipleship, truly following Jesus, is something that kind of sucks. It's something you don't want to do. Alexander and Rufus, in the tradition of the Zealots, expected the earthly Messiah to be a conquering hero that would reward them for following him. And lo and behold, their own father carried the cross of the real Messiah, the suffering servant, with whom you also suffer for following him. And James and John wanted to sit on his right and left in glory. And behold, that position was for the disgraced robbers, the robbers who shared his death. And that's Mark's MO, subverting expectations. We should see this Simon story as an example of that. As a side note, there was a famous person named Rufus that existed during this time period, Quintus Tineius Rufus, the consul of the year 127 AD, known as Rufus the Evil in Jewish sources. He was the supposed Roman ruler of Judea at the time of the Bar Kokhba War. He took command of the region after the expiration of the term of Lucius Quietus, for whom the Kitos War was named. It's possible that Mark may have had that person in mind also when he wrote this passage about Simon of Cyrene and his otherwise unattested sons. Lastly, I want to talk about one other major indicator that Mark was written in the 2nd century, and possibly even the main one, and that is that it is clearly based on the Hellenistic romance novels of that time period. And here I follow the work of Marianne Tolbert in Sowing the Gospel, her study of Mark. There were 5 major Hellenistic novels, and 2 of them, the 2 earliest ones, had the biggest influence on the Gospels. And these are Chareas and Kaliroe by the author Chariton, and The Ephesian Tale by Xenophon of Ephesus. Now, Tolbert places these novels relatively early, but if you notice, because these are non-religious, non-Christian ancient writings, scholars are usually a lot more circumspect with their dates. Now, the novel Kaliroe was written between 100 BC and 50 AD, and we know that it was written first because all the later novels reference it in some way. But it's Ephesian Tale by Xenophon, which is the true spiritual precursor to the Gospel of Mark, and she places it between 50 AD and 263 AD, with the earlier date being more likely. I think 263 AD is the date where we have like actual manuscript evidence of the book. But I looked further into the dating of the Ephesian Tale, and the research and evidence suggest that this novel was likely written in the early 2nd century. Now, for one thing, it references the Kaliroe novel, so it can't be that early. It also mentions a certain Roman government office that is not attested until the reign of Trajan, and I believe that Mark's gospel was written at the end of Trajan's reign. It also appears to assume that Pompeii has been destroyed, and we know that that happened in 79 AD, though as we'll see, Mark's gospel being based on the Ephesian Tale. Ephesian Tale is another one of those documents that plays fast and loose with geography and chronology. Now, the book is actually written in a style very similar to Mark. It's not written in the Koine Greek as Mark was, but it's in what's called the Attic style, which was heavily influenced by popular speech. And Tolbert says, quote, "In terms of language competency, Xenophon's authorial audience and Mark's authorial audience were on almost exactly the same level," end quote. It uses what's called parataxis, which is simple sentences and phrases joined together, oftentimes with minimal connection, which also happens to be one of Mark's favorite techniques. You know, Mark's style in general is this like highly paratactic, popular speech. The author oftentimes appears to be trying to mimic the rhythm of the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, especially the Elijah and Elisha stories in 1st and 2nd Kings. And it almost seems like Mark's gospel was intended to be acted out, or certainly at least read aloud or performed aloud. Well, I guess all books were read aloud back then, but Ephesian Tale has stereotypical set pieces like Mark does, and just like Mark, Xenophon often has large crowds randomly appear, more for story purposes than any kind of verisimilitude. It seems that what Mark was trying to do stylistically was to write the fictional story of Jesus that would remind the audience of the Septuagint, but as his overall framework, he used the dynamic of popular literature and popular culture, to which the Ephesian Tale already pointed the way. In other words, like I said at the beginning, he appropriated Ephesian Tale to write his Christian scripture. Apologists like to say that the Gospels are biographies, but other than the fact that they do focus on one particular figure like biographies do, they have very little in common with ancient biographies. They have much greater parallels with the Hellenistic novels, at least Mark does. When Matthew and Luke come along, they try to make up for what's lacking in Mark, adding a birth story, some childhood stories, and so on, but they're afraid to mess too much with Mark's framework, and these are Hellenistic novels. One of the main reasons why traditional scholars have been reluctant in the past to identify Mark as a kind of Hellenistic novel is because it's been known for a long time that those novels were created in the 2nd century, but at the same time, these scholars supposedly knew that the Gospels are all from the 1st century. So they have to do this weird sleight of hand where they're like, yeah, the Gospels have some similarities to, the Hellenistic romances, but, who knows? Maybe the Gospels and the romances were both borrowing from the general popular culture. over a 150-year period. I mean, come on. I mean, these early Christian writers would have a mental break if they didn't go more than one or two sentences without referencing something out of the Old Testament or something out of the intertestamental books. The Christian writings in general, like so many Greco-Roman writings from this time, are heavily influenced by their predecessors. They heavily reference and allude to other books because that's what ancient writers did. And many are familiar with the ideas of the scholar Dennis Ronald MacDonald, who finds references in Mark to the Iliad, the Odyssey, and so on. Well, the author of Mark borrowed in a similar way from Callirhoe and the Ephesian Tale. And I'm going to talk about Ephesian Tale for a minute. It begins suddenly with only a few lines of background. And then shortly after that, we start getting time cues, like when the procession was over. A few lines later, as soon as the dawn appeared. A few lines after that, when the time of the nuptials drew near, the vigils were celebrated. Almost reminds you of Mark 14 when he leads by saying that the Passover and unleavened bread were 2 days away. A few lines after that, as soon as the day appeared. Shortly after that, as soon as night appeared. And this is all in like the first chapter of the book. The ship passed by Cnidos and came within sight of Rhodes. 2 sentences later, the ship is accordingly brought into Rhodes. A large crowd gathers. They're amazed. They cry out that a god and goddess have arrived, talking about the hero and the heroine. And a few lines later, we get after the dedication was ended. And we also get a few asides here and there, digressions similar to Mark, when he tells the story of John the Baptist's death, which is basically a hard reboot of the Book of Esther. But just stylistically, even the most glancing analysis shows that this book has a lot in common with Mark. Like, Mark seems to be stuck on fast forward. One thing happens after another. It's like immediately this happened, then the next day this happened, then he comes into a house and this happened, and then a crowd gathered and said this. I think it's unquestionable that there are parallels here. If Mark is borrowing from a 2nd century novel, then I think that would be quite a strong indicator that Mark was written in the 2nd century. And yeah, I get that there's not like a one-to-one correspondence between these two writings. But if you're looking for a close parallel or antecedent anywhere, it would be in these Hellenistic novels. And I don't think it's likely that Ephesian Tale was the one that was borrowing from Mark. First of all, Mark doesn't seem to have had independent circulation over a wide area until way late. And secondly, Ephesian Tale is following its predecessor novel, Callirhoe, if anything. Now, there is one indicator, unlike the vast majority of the New Testament books, that Mark was written before 130 AD, and that is that unlike them, and unlike even the other Gospels, Mark does not use any phrases from the philosopher Epictetus, whose sayings and writings were disseminated in about that time period. Now, when we get to Matthew in particular, we'll see heavy borrowing from Epictetus and also some of the later versions of Paul's letters. I think it's safe to say that that book came out in the 120s or early 120s. The last thing I want to say is that the Gospel of Mark is itself based on sources. And we know that through the work of the form critics and Burton Mack and others. Mark has been described as pearls on a string, or as Nineham said, snapshots in a photo album, meaning it's a succession of independent stories strung together. And those stories obviously originated before Mark. But as I hinted earlier, for the most part, they were developed by rival Christian communities between the late 80s AD and about 110 or 115 AD. This was at the time in which these groups were coming into conflict, and they developed the standalone Jesus stories as a way to build up the authority of their own groups. The genius of Mark, if any, was to appropriate those tiny stories and kind of amalgamate them and string them into a new narrative that recontextualized them. And he uses literary techniques like chiasmus and intercalation to do that. I did find this incredible book from the 1890s, some psycho-conservative book that actually agrees that, yeah, Mark had sources, but those sources were actually 5.5-inch by 3.5-inch note cards that people like James, Mary, and Joseph had written on after witnessing things that Jesus did, and these became like the sources of Mark. I'm not kidding you. He literally said 5.5 by 3.5-inch note cards. Like maybe they were using a version of the Papias app. But I don't know. I leave that theory without commentary. Mark is a 2nd century text written about 50 years later than is commonly believed. I follow Theodore Whedon's thesis that Mark is a combination of different clashing traditions about Jesus, but that theory is actually somewhat common. The great mythicist G.A. Wells, Earl Doherty also hold to a version of it. The Kingdom Movement, the Miracle Worker sect, and the community of Mark were three distinct entities, and the Gospel of Mark was written to incorporate and to subordinate the claims of the first two groups. Now, why is it that we can say that these groups emerged after 70 AD and not just have been like the same groups but existing much earlier? Well, for one thing, the content of their preaching, the alleged sayings of Jesus, seems to presuppose that the temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed. And the second reason is that they look back on John the Baptist as being a figure from the remote past. This miracle sect that we talked about also shows up elsewhere. 2 Corinthians, it manifests itself as one of the opponents of Paul's Christianity. And in this same time period, 2 Corinthians chapter 10 through 12, where Paul completely blasts this group, I would place this passage around the same time, like 120 AD, quote, "Someone who comes preaching another Jesus that we didn't preach, or taking a different spirit which you didn't take, or a different gospel that you didn't receive, I lack nothing compared to these super apostles," end quote. And there's also the story of the miracle working prophet, son of Jesus, in Acts of the Apostles, that preserves the memory of these Schmendricks. And this group was widespread and was a big threat to the other sect because they had a powerful message. We perform healing miracles through the power of Jesus. Paul's church attacked that view because it was a threat to their authority. But Mark attacked that view because his church, first of all, did not believe that there was such a thing as the indwelling power of Jesus. They originally believed that Jesus was going to come to earth someday at the end of the world. And our job through, until then is to muddle through as best we can, keep the faith kind of. It's nowhere near as glamorous and powerful as like this Dutch Vanderlyn gang that rolls into town and says, well, Jesus is here right now. He just healed your grandma. I mean, I did the healing, but it was actually Jesus working through me. And that view conflicted with everything that Mark stood for. So what he did was he wrote a biography of Jesus that placed him in the recent past and attributed to him all the miracles, all the teachings, all the wonders that these rivals were talking about. But he made them moot. Because to Mark, the point of Jesus' life was to act as the suffering Messiah and to thereby validate the fact that he was the Son of God, the promised Son of God in the Scriptures. The idiot centurion at the end of Mark's gospel is one of the only ones to realize this. And now, because Jesus has lived and died in the past, his coming at the end of the world now becomes a return. So by doing this, Mark is also actually giving hope to his community. Jesus will come someday, but we don't know when. But if you think about it, he wasn't here that long ago, and he probably won't be gone for very long. And this was the innovation of Mark. He takes the opportunity also to trash their claims of authority. He attacks the legend of the 12, the legend of Cephas, the rock man, the prophet of Christianity. Remember that the belief of the miracle worker sect and the kingdom sect was that Jesus appeared to the 12 after his resurrection, first to Peter, and that he continues to appear and dwell in some way in these miracle-performing Christians. Mark absolutely blows up their spot by changing that resurrection story to a lame-ass transfiguration appearance. And he also tries to differentiate Christianity as far as possible from the proto-rabbis, whom he portrays as the ancient Pharisees, and from Judaism in general, against the general background of the Kitos rebellion. He uses pre-existing stories and sayings that he borrows from the rival groups. Everything else he gets from the Old Testament, or from his own creative freedom, making it up, basically. The last thing I want to say is that when it comes to the date of Mark, we have to account for possible different editions of Mark. Now, the Gospel of Luke seems to have been based on a copy of Mark that was missing a page. There's some evidence that Mark was a living document, like a Google Doc that was updated over time. Certain things like maybe the temptation of Jesus, that line about a new teaching with authority, some of the so-called Mark Q overlaps, the piece of info that says that Andrew, James, and John were the only ones present when Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. Also the specific line, the Sabbath was made for man and not men for the Sabbath, which is not in Matthew or Luke. And certainly things like the various endings of Mark, which were not original to the gospel, like the shorter ending, the longer ending, the freer logion, the secret ending, the double secret probation ending, the cute ending, the sexy ending, the who knows what the fuck ending, and lastly, the double secret sexy ending. I think that whoever wrote the long ending, the same one that Irenaeus already knows in the 180s, was the same Shmagegi who edited the gospel into its final form and added some of that stuff. And who knows, that probably was Irenaeus himself. Now, in our time together, we have exposed the late origins and the fictive nature of the Gospel of Mark as we continue with our New Testament journey. I've begun to demonstrate that this document, the first biographical source for the life of Jesus, the source of all other biographical information about him, was composed not just to firmly establish his life in history, but to answer and annihilate competing views of Jesus that threaten Mark's community. But above all, we demonstrated that the text was written much later than the 65 to 75 AD time period in which it's usually placed. Specifically, that it was written after the Kitos Rebellion that ended at the death of the Emperor Trajan in 117 AD, likely completed by 120 or 121. We dispense with the belief that this text is early, and in the presence of Saint Eddie, in the day of Saint Gordy, in the name of Saint Candida, we declare the Gospel of Mark to be late and spurious. I invited you to ask yourself at the beginning of the show whether or not you believe there's any compelling reason to consider the Gospel of Mark a reliable and early source for the life of Jesus, and I hope that you accept my verdict. In the next episode, we may continue with Mark. Paul's letter to the Philippians lurks on the horizon. The Gospel of Matthew could certainly use to be taken down a peg. Last time, I started comparing this show to a pirate ship, and I think it's an apt comparison. I mean, I know it sounds a bit trite, but a pirate ship is quite a good analogy for this program, not only because of the connotations of raiding or attacking the conventional view of Christian origins, but also because pirates were rejected by the mainstream in their own time. I mean, a pirate in the 1700s, the heyday of privateering, could never have been expected to be granted a teaching position in the field of New Testament studies, no matter how keen his insight may have been. Thank you for listening. Join me next time. This criticism is ended. Go in peace.
What other stories of mythology do you think of as historical reality?